Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Scott Rubin, a senior consultant for the Forum for World Education, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this next installment of FWE's webinar series entitled Supporting Public Education in the U.S. For those of you that are new to FWE, we were founded in 2018 as an organization that is dedicated to transforming public education for future generations of students by bringing together business leaders, education researchers, policymakers, and philanthropists to discuss and implement proven policies and practices that will prepare students to thrive in an interconnected, technology-rich, and global economy. Our discussion today brings together all of these elements with a particular focus on the U.S. public education system. To lead us in this discussion, it is a great pleasure to introduce the President Emerita of Teachers College, Columbia University, the founding director of the Consortium for Policy Research in Education, a past president of the National Academy of Education, and the former dean of the University of Pennsylvania's Graduate School of Education, as well as a colleague, mentor, and friend, Dr. Susan Fuhrman. Susan will be introducing our illustrious panel and help guide their conversations as we explore the topic of supporting public education in the U.S. Susan?
Thank you, Scott. It's a pleasure to be here this morning. I'm going to introduce my colleagues on the panel, starting with a woman who I usually introduce as my dissertation advisor and my PhD, Donna Shalala, but she is much better known as former Secretary of Health and Human Services during the Clinton administration, and most recently, Congress person representing Florida's 27th district. She's also headed 3 major higher education institutions in the United States and has honors too numerous to mention, and including the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Jeffrey Henig, Professor Jeffrey Henig is a colleague at Teachers College whose field is politics and education, just like Donna's and mine. There aren't that many of us with that field. I think Donna actually started that field in this country, and Jeff continues the tradition by continuing to lead that program at Teachers College, and he is also a professor of political science at Columbia University. Jeff is exceedingly well known for many books on urban education in the United States, including The Color of School Reform, Race, Politics, and the Challenge of Urban Education, and A Spin Cycle, How Research is Used in Policy Debates. And a new friend is Stephen Gluckstern, who is founder, chairman, and CEO of Santa Fe Farms. Stephen has over 35 years of business experience, ranging from founding startups to managing multi-billion-dollar corporations. He has been a CEO, chairman, and board member of a number of public and private companies, and currently serves in a gubernatorial appointed position as chair of the New Mexico Education Retirement Board. Thank you, everyone, for joining this panel. Just as by way of introduction, particularly for our international colleagues, the notion that government should support education for people who will become the future citizenry goes back very far in United States history and is embedded in our way of life. But kind of uniquely, that responsibility is carried out by local governments predominantly, with considerable assistance from the state government and an infusion of about 10% of total funding from the federal government, with more or less large additions at various times. We actually in the United States are living right now through a time where the US federal government will be providing, I think it's 170 something billion dollars to K-12 education in its attempt to recover from the pandemic. The most US school children in K-12 go to public schools. Only about 10% go to private schools. And there is a phenomenon in our country called charter schools, which are publicly funded schools, but operate more like independent schools in their freedom from regulation. And that is a developing phenomenon which is growing and is the subject of a lot of conversation in this country. But the overwhelming number of students are in old traditional public schools run by local school districts, which are most frequently the same or identical to the cities or the municipalities in which they live. I'm going to start by asking the panel why this devotion to public education has been so important in the United States, why we've maintained that tradition for several hundred years, a couple of hundred years. So let me start with Donna, and then we can just pick up in a conversation.
For the United States, as well as for your international observers, nation building is critical, and public education is critical to nation building. It creates Americans in our case. It brings people of different backgrounds together from their neighborhoods, from their communities, and it gives them an education to create citizens. And that's true. And we make this case all over the world that if you want to build a great nation, you have to have a great public education system.
I can see you nodding, Jeff. You obviously agree.
Oh, sure. I do think that's an important part of the history. And, you know, it's important in terms of understanding, in particular, the history and some of the changes more recently, that in the US, the decentralized nature of this system has also helped bolster support in some ways by kind of helping to buffer public education from some of the big battles that take place when you need to negotiate conflicting visions of education or conflicting values at a national level in local communities, especially when they're relatively homogeneous or when they're dominated by a local elite, you know, that can impose its vision. The schools have taken on historically in the US a kind of outside of politics dimension that's helped their popularity, but which, as I'm sure we'll talk about at some points today, has been eaten at a little bit in recent decades.
Stephen, you have mentioned in the past that you also, the economic impetus behind education is an important one.
Yeah, well, certainly, and I agree with Donna's comment about nation building, but part of what does it mean to build a nation? That's both from sort of a political perspective, but also from a capitalist perspective in our nation. And so clearly schooling was certainly viewed historically as a way in which you prepared young people to be able to fulfill a role in a business world, in a world that's driven by capitalism. We've been better or worse at it at various times, and it's a particular, from my perspective, particular challenge now as the future is a little less clear to see. You know, back when we were 200 years ago, you could sort of look out 20 years and feel confident you might know what the world was going to look like. And I think that we've lost much of that confidence now of really being able to know what the economy in 2030 or 40 or 50 really is going to look like.
Yeah, that's what makes public education important, because we're anticipating the future by educating our population in a way in which they can absorb the changes in the future.
Yeah. You know, it's so interesting and important that we have clung to the ideal of the school system as bringing us all together and making us all Americans, despite the fact that our system was segregated for, over 100 years of the existence of public education by law, and continues to be segregated today by virtue of geography. So, how do you explain that?
Well, it still brings communities together, Susan. It still brings neighborhoods together. It still bonds young people, even though, because we're committed to local education, our system is often segregated by neighborhood, but we have moved beyond that with special ways of bringing kids together across the communities, with schools that have specialties. For example, in my community in Miami, kids go all over town because they want to go to magnet schools. Whether they're low income or high income, they want to go to these magnet schools. So we have figured out how to integrate students better by creating opportunities that attract students from different parts of the community. But we're still working on it. Public education is a work in progress.
Yeah, just to explain,
fundamental.
A magnet school is a school around a particular theme, like the arts, which might appeal to certain students.
Or science, or the
Right.
environment, or criminal justice. I mean, we've done it as a hook to attract students and keep them in school. We've identified themes for our schools, even though the basic education may be similar.
And that I just sort of, just to emphasize it, both in terms of what's different about the US from many other nations, but also what's been changing in the US, which is not only is the system here historically decentralized to the local level with over 13,000 school districts, but for years, and still in most cases, the schools themselves have been zoned for attendance geographically, so that students are assigned a school based on where they live. And that's been very ingrained in the US, so that people actually have historically chosen where to live, often based on where the home school would be. So the country sorted itself out geographically and residentially, partly in ways that reinforce this small aspect of public education, localized at the district level, localized at the neighborhood level. And that's been partly what's been changing through magnet schools, as Donna mentions. That's another way in which charter schools, which you mentioned earlier, Susan, have kind of challenged a little bit that historic hyper decentralization.
Stephen?
Yeah, I would say that I agree with what both Don and Jeff said, although it's interesting because there's been a transition, I think, in sort of the minds of American of what schools are really supposed to do. And if we go back, 50 or 100 years, people had a view of what school's purpose was. And, I think that Donna's sort of large scale discussion of nation building is the right way to think about it. Today, I think it was probably thought of more narrowly before, which is this is where kids go to learn, and they learn how to read and learn how to write and learn how to get ready to take a job. And today, I think our view of schools is now radically different in their role in our society, much more expansive. Part of the complexity of what's happened to us, right, of what the role of a teacher is and what the role of this institution really becomes. And it's part of this. I think the disruption in our view of what public education, how it's supported, has also changed because of the people's view of what it's supposed to be doing.
But it's still fundamental to our economy.
Mhm.
We
Absolutely.
still believe as Americans, no matter what we debate about public education and around the world, that if you educate your population, you have a better chance of being economically successful, not only individually, but as the nation as a whole.
But let me ask you about that nation building ideal. We have a citizenry that has a relatively low turnout for elections, even really important elections. We have many people who don't vote. We have extreme polarization, political polarization at the moment. So, our school's doing well in that nation building effort.
Though we just had the biggest turnout we've ever had because we made it more accessible. We allowed people to vote by mail, for example. States are changing their rules. Now they're changing their rules to get more narrow. But, I have always believed that we should lower the voting age so that we could use public schools as a way of getting kids started thinking about their communities. So I have always been in favor, for instance, of a 16-year-old voting age, because if we do it later at 18, for example, the kids are out of school and we haven't
Right.
had a chance to link the education system with the civic system as cleanly.
Yeah, one of my concerns about civics education in the US schools, which, first of all, it's been de-emphasized over the last 20 years or so as we focus so much on reading and math attainment, but also it very much has centers on civic activism around students running their own efforts to recycle or their own public service campaigns, and less about teaching students the importance of government and getting involved in government and going to town council meetings. And I'm hoping that in the future we can refocus civics education more on the role of government so that we can get the kind of electoral turnout that we need in this country.
Susan, I think you're.
Go ahead, Stephen.
Go ahead, Jeff. I was going to say, Susan, I just wanted to comment on your statement of whether or not we've done a very good job of nation building. And in fact, I think that one of the failings, or one of the less successful things we're doing in public education is preparing our citizenry to roll in our normal life. And I think you're exactly right that whether it be civics or basic economics and how you home the management of your own financial situation, there are a couple of things like that in fact we've fallen down on the job of and have not done as good a job, and that's led to by the way, I think that's one of the things led to the polarization in this country is in fact this ability to people to live only in and think only in their own pockets without having some chance to understand we are citizens of a single nation. So I do think that's an issue and something that we do need to address in our system.
Yeah, and I was going to say that after a couple of decades in which under both Republican and Democratic White Houses, the education emphasis was in practice largely built around improving academic performance in math and reading and tested performance and standardized tests. There is something of a broad kind of backlash. I wouldn't call it a tidal wave, but it's at least a backwash in terms of interest, both on the right and left in this civic mission. I do think that the polarization that we've talked about at various times already today is also lies inside that agreement. So that there's a kind of a shallow consensus that we need to do more about civic engagement, civic education, but the vision of what that means is quite different as it's held by some of the stakeholders in the nation right now.
While we're still on this topic of the importance of public education, I want to point out that we have also in this country made a commitment to including immigrants, even those who are here illegally because they haven't attained refugee status or gone through asylum proceedings or all the other legal proceedings that might exist. We've made a commitment to educating them at the local level, and that says something about how we value public education and how we see it as a nation-building exercise. We've already moved into my next question a little bit by talking about some of the challenges that public education faces. We've mentioned, for example, that students are segregated by neighborhood often and don't mix in the way that you'd want a fully integrated citizenry to mingle. So let's move on to that topic. What do you see as the major challenges facing public education?
Well, I would see the general support by the public for public education as public education is attacked. And as we start in some communities to drain off and in states to drain off those resources into private charter schools, that's a big challenge in the places where I live, even though there's general support for public education. And the second challenge is the push to make it more narrow and to worry about the first job as opposed to understanding that it's got to be broad enough to absorb the future, what I call absorb the future, that we have to worry not about whether a high school graduate can get their first job if they don't go to college, but whether they have a skill set in which they can continue to learn as the world changes under their feet.
Right. I agree. Stephen, you've mentioned in the past the importance of teachers and our challenges in finding and preparing teachers for a 21st century education.
There's no question that I, from my personal perspective, that making sure that we maintain thoughtful, creative, loving, all those attributes of what teachers, that's what makes our education system. I don't believe you can have a good education system without those kind of role models literally in front of the classroom. That's from my own perspective. That's where we go. I think that's obviously one of the challenges today is attracting people and continue to keep them in this profession. It is a hard job. And although Susan didn't mention this in my introduction, I spent a decade in public education, ended up as a school district superintendent. So have some sort of a foot in both camps and just know how hard that job really is. And what it means to be a teacher. And so clearly that's one of our challenges. I think Donna mentioned some others, this question of how do we prepare people for the future? Well, that's what does it mean to be prepared for the future? And as Jeff talked about, sort of we went to this incredible focus on math and reading and testing of that, and we may have left off some of the other things because that alone is not going to prepare you for the future. How you make decisions, how you evaluate problems, how you decide the difference between right and wrong, those are things that we may be a little less articulate about exactly how to teach those, but those are, to me, more important. In the end, you have to know how to read and do math, that's for sure. But that's not gonna make your way in the future of our country. We need a greater set of skills there.
And if we're talking about creating Americans, we also have to have historical context. Students have to be able to fit things into the histories of the world of their countries, and that's just as important. You know, talking about teachers, I once, with the head of the teachers union in New York, when I was president of Hunter College, we came up with this idea of swapping positions. And that is, we would ask our faculty to teach in a high school for a week, and she would have her teachers teach in the college for a week. We got lots of teachers from the high schools volunteering. I could not get one faculty member. I mean, the idea of being in class all day long was overwhelming to them.
No, it's true. But that's not the only reason it's hard to recruit public school teachers. We used to have a built-in labor force of women, often very well-educated women who had no other options or few other options. And of course, over the last 40 years or so, that's changed dramatically, and women are choosing other professions. And unlike some other countries that are involved in the Forum for World Education, the US doesn't provide a lot of incentives for people to go into teaching.
Though, Susan, I think during COVID has changed some parents' attitudes towards the role of teachers. They suddenly, with their kids at home, have realized how hard it is. And it's not just the remote response to remote, but I think they have new respect for teachers.
And that's following, I would say, an extended period in which the reputation of teachers as professionals has been eroded, sometimes deliberately, as part of a political argument to suggest that the educators have kind of dominated public schooling to the exclusion of parents and citizenry, and some of that's been an attack on teacher unions, but it's spilled over to teachers generally. So teachers have kind of lost this sense of the public really being behind them and supporting them. That may be, as Donna's suggesting, that may be changing a little bit. There have been other signs that teachers are regaining some of their stature and support. But for a long time, there was a message being driven around that teachers, they've got this easy job. They only have to work 9 months a year. They're paid a lot. They're paid a lot compared to median workers in some communities, but not compared to other folks with their education level. And so I think that's possibly also contributed to this sense of teaching not as an elevated pursuit that the best and the brightest should aspire to, but as something that that the best and brightest would find beneath them.
Yeah.
And I would say, so another aspect to me of sort of the challenges is that I don't think we have done a particularly good job of integrating technology in its widest sense into the public school system. I think educators have reject is too strong a word, but I think it's been difficult, and that we haven't been as creative collectively as how we might use some of these technologies. It's not just like, oh, now I used to have an overhead projector, and now I have a computer which can put a PDF on the wall. That part's easy. Can technology maybe help us be better at the very act of teaching?
And again, COVID may have introduced some of
the
that.
repetitive things. And what does curriculum look like, and what does it mean to have a digitized curriculum?
Right. Donna, I think you were starting to say that.
Yeah, I think COVID, because
world.
we've done remote learning, the first year was rough, but I think it's helped. And it's opened teachers' eyes to ways of communicating using technology. And we've added some skill sets, I think. But we need to build on that. I think Stephen is absolutely right. We need to build up. We need to take advantage of some of the things that we've learned and the fact that teachers are a little more comfortable.
Right. And we need to use technological advances to build capacity in the teaching force itself. Now that we, as Donna said, we as parents realize just how challenging teaching is and how much support teachers need. There are many ways through artificial intelligence and products that incorporate simulations and other kinds of activities for teachers to help them teach.
Susan, one of the things that, as a business person, and that my perspective here is, I guess that's where I'm lining up from, is one of the things that's clearly happened is I don't think that the average student graduating today from American public schools, their skills as writers is not strong. And part of that is writing something you have to practice, right? It's not something someone can just tell you, oh, here's how you do it. You have to do it. And the truth is that teaching of writing is difficult. It is really hard for a teacher who has 30 children in a classroom to say, why don't you go home tonight and write a one page, and then have that teacher take the time to review 30 different essays and spend the time. That is an area where, for instance, artificial intelligence, which you mentioned, can have a profound impact, because that's as an example of where we could use technology to really change and transform. Because if you could have a student have to write a one-page paragraph every night and have it reviewed and have it criticized and then have work with that student, that is how that particular skill, and as a business person looking to hire people, we always do a little bit of a writing sample, because being able to express yourself in writing, I think, is a fundamental part of being a well-educated and informed and capable adult in our society.
Yeah, I will say that, I obviously am a big supporter of using technology and using it wisely. I don't think we attend sufficiently to the research base on which technological projects are developed, whether they incorporate what we know about learning sufficiently, and we don't evaluate them sufficiently to see if they are actually effective in the classroom. I'd like to move on to a major challenge in this country, which has to do with social justice and the extent to which we value all our Americans who attend public schools, and whether we can improve the respect that we show one another and the understanding of historical and cultural contributions. That's become increasingly important here. And I wonder,
one of the bedrock principles, going back to our opening discussion about the positive role of education, but in the US, and one of the sources of its support was as part of this concept of a melting pot. Mm-hmm. But in practice, melting pot to a lot of folks meant bring in other elements, people from other countries, and turn them into Americans like us. And what's proven to be much more abrasive in terms of public will and support is the notion of integrating various populations with different cultural language backgrounds in ways that still respect their culture and language and background, and is interpreted by some as sort of a challenge to or a threat to my idea of an America. So what we're seeing now is, sort of this, again, this clash of visions between schools as a way to ideally to incorporate different groups and empower young people from different backgrounds to participate on their own terms in society, versus a kind of a return to and an aggressive return to an idea of turning immigrant students into Americans the way we think of that. And that's manifested itself, I'll just say briefly, in terms of recent state legislative action in a number of places to ban curriculum around issues relating to systemic racism and its history in the U.S., and to mandate kind of a great man vision of education that's at least what people remember that they were exposed to as kids.
Yeah, and that is very worrisome. I don't think that we've seen the full influence of the Black Lives Matter movement, and then some of the reaction to it that you were talking about in public education because of COVID, because it's been remote. And, coming back next year, which we all assume will be an in-person school year, I think we're going to see a lot of these issues rise to the surface.
Jeff, I think the point you made is actually really, really quite important in terms of this notion of social justice. And that's because the Americans have different views of what social justice means and what it means for them. And this country is going through a profound change in terms of just recognizing what kind of society we all thought we lived in particular, white men like you and me, and what our role was and where we were and what our power was, to a world where it's changing. It's just changing the nature of who we are and who populates this country and who comes here. This is a moment in our history. This is an immigrant base. We're all immigrants here, unless you're a Native American, right? We were all brought here one way or another. And I think that's part of the issue right now in terms of people view what social justice means. And I think whether it be Black Lives Matter, or I've recently been spending a lot of time reading about Native American history, which I have to admit I knew nothing about, despite having been educated. I thought about what our history really was here, that those issues, and those are pretty deep issues into why public education support may be getting, why it's debated, because there's certainly a portion of our population that doesn't want to go and look backwards like that, or thinks that that's views different, or they want to stay in the history. They want to retain the powers that they have and are not really that interested in having minorities educated or take positions up in schools or all those kinds of things. So I think the issues, it's a deep and profound issue in terms of the future of our education.
Yeah. Donna, you look like you wanted to say something.
Yeah. Well, while the attacks and the controversy is within education, I think it's important to remember what Lawrence Kremen taught us, that students are educated in a wider world. And there are other ways in which they get their information, and social media and television and movies, all of that impacts on their education. And Black Lives Matter may have had a bigger impact on libraries and on social media and on television programs and other kinds, and movies. So we've got to, our narrow focus just on public education has to be in a wider context, I think, as we're talking about things like social justice.
I agree. Let me move on to another challenge. K through 12 is 12 years of education, 1 year of kindergarten. Our President Biden is talking about that not being enough, that we need 2 years of preschool, we need at least 2 years of post-secondary education. And we also know that the economy is changing and that traditional preparation for the workforce has always been weak in this country, and that we need to improve that, and we need to think about education's role. So how do you think about that in light of the current challenges to public education?
Well, I obviously think the president is absolutely right, that we need to make a public commitment to both the front end, the pre-K end, and most of the rest of the world does this, or at least in countries that can afford it, plus add 2 more years. And what he's talking about is really writing a check, that the financing of this, it's up to us to determine what the curriculum is. We've had in pre-K, we've had lots of experience from Head Start to childcare. I mean, we know something about how you integrate learning. We don't know as much about how you make it seamless into the first years of elementary school, but we know something. So I think what he's saying is significant. Whether Congress will buy off on that huge investment, I don't know. But I think that we ought to, because I think it's related to the economy, not only to the education of kids, but the ability of parents to go back to work and know their children are getting a program of enrichment, and the ability of people, of everyone, to get access to post-secondary education.
Yeah. Stephen, you looked like you wanted to say something.
I was going to ask Donna a question. If you had to choose the 2 years before age 5 or 2 years after age 16, how would you make that choice?
Oh, I do the preschool. I mean, I do the pre-K because that's where we have the most data. I guess I do that. I think that because we have a mixture of public and private in post-secondary, some of the private I don't like much because it's fly by night, and we've been using Pell Grants in for the international audience. The way in which we finance post-secondary education has allowed in a bunch of bad actors, in my judgment. And so if we could do something about quality on that end, I think we could use a mixture of government, business, industry, and some innovation in terms of training and opportunities.
Yeah.
There's a little bit of a paradox in the fact that the research on the benefits of early childhood education has been growing and is pretty impressive, and we know the important things in terms of cognitive development, neurological development happen younger, and that these can be times of intervention that can have a long-lasting effect. But it may be that what it takes to flip the switch politically is not the accumulation of this kind of evidence, but the stark issues of getting women into the workforce, and something that another kind of it's hard to talk about silver linings with COVID, and I don't mean to do that, but we talked earlier about one of the additional things that COVID has brought home to people is the role of education in terms of supporting diversifying workforce. And on the positive side, and as we get to the questions about what do we do to build support for public education, that's one of the things that the business community responds to, even if they're not necessarily totally immersed in or convinced by the research support.
Yeah.
It has been for a long time. Susan, you'll remember the first reports of the CED on investments, which was basically the business community saying, we've got to invest in early childhood education.
Yeah. And that's
critical
as you said, the research is indisputable, and we know the long-term payoffs, not the immediate academic payoffs, but the long-term payoffs in terms of life opportunities and life success are, kind of unparalleled in the research world. There aren't any findings that are stronger than those about the long-term benefits of early childhood education.
Quality
is incredibly important. That's right. A lot of the studies were done on very high quality programs, and we have to make sure that the quality exists, which will also be a challenge because we don't pay and support K-12 teachers enough, and we certainly don't pay and support pre-K teachers enough to assure that kind of quality. So we're going to have to face up to that. So we've already talked a little bit about support for public education and how the public feels about it. We've run regular surveys every year. It's the Gallup survey of the American public, and that's shown consistently that people give their own schools, their own neighborhood schools, a pretty high mark, but they give the whole school system in the US a pretty low mark, one of the lowest among the institutions that are ranked. So, is that an issue? Is public support a challenge, or can we just assume everybody will support their own local schools and, not worry about it?
It's a challenge when you want to do national legislation. It certainly is a challenge when you want to do national legislation. The critics have dominated the public discussion about public schools far more than pointing out that the vast majority of leaders in this country are graduates of public schools. And I mean, in the business community in particular.
No, it's true.
One of the, two things that reinforce themselves, but they are distinct, have been happening in the US over the last couple of decades at least, and both have a centralizing effect in terms of the dialogue about public education. So there's been the growing role of states rather than local communities, and the growing role of the federal government relative to states and local communities. At the same time, in more of the civic space, there's been a nationalization of dialogue about education with various kinds of groups. On the one hand, private sector actors, in some cases, for-profit companies that are marketing goods and services and curriculum and training nationally. Also, interest groups that are battling at the national level, but are getting more and more involved in local communities and funding school board elections and things like that. So there's some very good things about moving this dialogue up to the state and national level. That's where there has been more potential to address issues of equity and social justice than when things are decentralized, given the overall inequalities in the nation. But the downside of that is that it's elevating the debate into these arenas where these abstract notions of what does education mean are absorbed by the public and are more negative. When they see education, their kids' schools, their kids' teachers, they like it. When they hear about education on the news or through social media, generally they don't like what they're hearing. And so that creates a real challenge to building support.
So how do you square the growing charter movement with what you just said about people valuing their own local schools, and with the historical data about people valuing their own local schools? They are going to, in small numbers to start, but in increasing numbers, schools that are distinct from local public schools and that actually separate their kids from the kids in the local school district, even though they're publicly funded.
Yeah, well, at the local level, the charter school movement, is different than as it's debated at the national level. At the national level, it's debated as public versus private. It's an ideological thing. At the local level, it's a lot of it's parochial. It's based on what are the opportunities for my kid in my neighborhood. So parents in communities are looking at, in some communities are looking at charter schools, not because they think markets in general are better than government in providing education. It's because they happen to be living somewhere where their local public school is not a very good one, and a charter school provides another option. And you get, families moving back and forth between charters and traditional public schools based on characteristics of their individual kid at different ages as they move through the system. So I don't think it's as big a contradiction as it appears initially.
Anybody else? Donna, you mentioned that.
That's an interesting perspective. The charter school movement in a lot of parts of the country is fueled by greed, by wanting to take some of that tax money and moving it to essentially private schools, about wanting more flexibility in the hiring and firing of personnel. we've done some evaluations of them, and it depends on their mix of students in terms of outcomes in my judgment. But if public schools were more nimble, more responsive, more flexible in those places where the public schools have developed a magnet school program, where they focused on what the parents are telling them, we've had, I think, less of a problem with that kind of politics than in other places where we put our feet into cement and we're unwilling to move.
Yeah,
So
Stephen,
it's a
any
combination
thoughts on-
of a couple of things.
Yeah. Stephen, any thoughts on local support and whether it's still strong?
So, no, I agree with predominantly what Jeff and Donna have said, which is I think that when people think of their own children and that notion, that's kind of how they think about public education. Right? You think about it in the context of your own sphere, and it becomes more and more abstract as you begin to think about other people in other towns. And when you're a grandparent, and all of a sudden, and having been a new grandparent, all of a sudden it's come back into focus. Hey, where's my granddaughter going to go to school? And I want her to have a public school education. So I think that it clearly it's centralized. I think Jeff's points were important, which is that I wrote it's none of us are all that young, but I wrote my dissertation 50 years ago, which is hard for me to believe, but 50 years ago, looking at alternative schools, which were 50 years ago, sort of a movement that was not dissimilar to charters, although it was done deeply within the public school system.
Right.
There was no money being siphoned, but the idea was, could you create choice within a public school system and in a public school setting to allow parents to be able to see what might be best for their kids? So I do think, however, that Susan, I'm with you in the long run. I don't believe that public support for education is going away. I think that it's something that how each town may choose to spend it or want to spend it or how they structure it might be different. But I'm not worried that somehow we wake up tomorrow and find out that people decide public schools are not something that our government and our society should support.
Jeff, do you think that charters are a threat to the melting pot ideal of American education?
Well, they have, so again, as Donna mentioned also, the charter school world is pretty diverse. You've got a lot of very small charters that are rooted in communities, and then you've got large charter networks. The research on effectiveness is complicated, but one way to summarize it is it's kind of a wash. There are good charters and bad charters, just like there are good traditional public schools and bad traditional schools. But ironically, the charter schools, which early on people feared a lot, and I was fearful of that they would sort of pick and choose students and make their pitches primarily towards more affluent, easy to educate kids and white kids. The charter sector, as it evolved, became largely a black and brown sector in the U.S. With some exceptions. Charters are, in many instances, more segregated than the public school districts in which they're located. And part of the rationale, that some charter advocates have is people self-selecting into communities of people like them. Now ideally the argument is people like them is sharing the same educational values, but unfortunately, in many instances, that does turn out to be defined by race and ethnicity. So in that sense, it does have the potential to exacerbate the segregation in the country.
I've certainly seen that in other countries where public money goes to private education and where schools become very exclusively, people like me, and public money are going to support these enclaves, which really do detract from the idea of building the nation as a whole. So hopefully the American commitment to that melting pot and to the nation building will sustain. How can we improve the support for public education? What can we as leaders and educators do? What can we as a nation do to improve the support?
Susan, I think it's got to be done by non-educators. I think the business community has a really significant role here. It's all the people who have benefited from public education, including leaders in higher education. I can't tell you, particularly in a place like Miami, where there's a big charter school movement, how many people came to me and said, I think the University of Miami, which is a private university, ought to partner with us on a charter school. And my answer was no, we're committed to the public school system in our community, that we're not going to get involved, that I'm happy to work with magnet schools and with lab schools that are essentially public schools, but we're not getting involved in that. And I think people were shocked because the public universities did partner with private schools, but I've been a public school person. Listen, I went to a technical high school. So one of the reasons I'm attracted to magnet schools is kids came from all over the city in Cleveland to go to West Tech. So I went to school with kids from all over the city. Most of them didn't go to college because they were in technical education. Many of them did higher education later, but I'm just committed to public schools. So it's got to be leaders in all of the sectors that make that commitment. And it can't necessarily be led, and particularly the business community, it can't necessarily be led by educators in the community. And most of the business leaders in this country have gone to public schools. They may have gone to private universities, but they went to public schools.
So Steve, does business have a role in improving support for public schools?
Oh, I think absolutely. I think Donna's spot on. I think that it has to be driven by sort of the larger community of individuals who are here. I also what makes it difficult, and Jeff alluded to this, is that, and I think Susan, you did as well, where the support actually comes from is interesting, right? And how much it's hard to create a national movement if you're talking about local schools with local school boards and local control. I think we're going to enter into an interesting period. As you pointed out, there's a big chunk of money now that's going to be made available to our local schools coming federally. And in the end, I think if you want to change the financing part of this, that if we want to use money as one of those things out there as the carrot, that it probably can't, it's not going to come from raising local taxes. It's going to come from some other movement, other source of funds. It'll be very interesting to see what this contribution does here. And hopefully, whether it be putting more infrastructure in so that we can provide access to, I'm from New Mexico, and a shocking number of our children don't have access to broadband. And how can you expect people to be taught at home in school if they can't log on to their computer? So I think that yes, business has a role, yes, government has a role, but probably beyond just local government.
I was on a panel yesterday with local and state educators about this infusion of federal funds that's in the pandemic recovery legislation. And I was very encouraged. I was worried that people would go out and buy things because there's a limited time period for spending these funds. And it's a lot of money to spend all at once. But I was very encouraged by their desire to invest in long-term things, infrastructure, of course, but also professional development, working with parents, purchasing materials that they can do research on as they use them, and then evaluate them, and not rushing in to assume that you can buy something to solve the problem. So that was encouraging.
And Susan, remember that it's not just the education tranche that was put in, it's the broadband tranche.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
I mean, there is a huge multi-billion-dollar investment in broadband that for the whole country that accompanies this, that will change rural America, minority communities. In Miami, with all our low-income kids, we handed out laptops.
Yes. But handing out the laptops is interesting because it then kind of creates an imperative to fill it with products and to use it, to continue to use a one-to-one form of instruction. Whereas we're hoping everybody goes back to some sort of communal in-person instruction,
Well,
maybe
they will. They may have
mixed
their homework on the
Right.
laptops.
in.
And
Right.
of course, we've been able to reduce the dependency in higher education on books and going to articles by
Right.
and the cost of higher education.
Yeah, it's true.
In addition to business, and I'm going to pose this in a way as a question to Donna and Susan as former leaders in higher education, whether Donna's point about educators can't lead, that I get the argument, but whether higher education institutions have a positive role or potential role to play here that's different. Because one of the things that's, I think, pretty apparent, I mean, we talk, and it's right to talk about the broad collective benefits that public education provides as society, but families are motivated a lot by what's it going to mean for my kid, and they make a lot of their decisions about education, not so much what's my kid going to learn, but and of course that's important, and how's my kid going to develop, but it's also, is my kid going to get into the best colleges and universities? And we to the extent that families sense, and in some sense there's a reality, that getting into certain networks or certain institutions that support them in a way that's going to get them into the best colleges and universities is an important part of what they're thinking about education. One of the challenges is for us to sort of convince them not through propaganda, but through reality, that public schools and public education actually is the institution through which their kids can thrive in that way as well.
Donna?
Well, I came out of Wisconsin during a certain period in my career, and we tied access to higher education directly to the curriculum of the public schools. And because we wanted to be very clear with parents on what it would take, not only to get into the University of Wisconsin-Madison, but in the other schools. And we worked out the curriculum with the school system, the centralized school system, on exactly what the kids had to do to prepare. And then we gave everybody 10 years to get there, to start to fold in the courses that we thought were necessary for preparation for the higher education system. And it actually worked. I got the idea out of one of Lawrence Kremen's early books that talked about how the curriculum of higher education was driven and how it played a role in improving public education by linking access with that. Of course, we have a very different level of access than we did in the 19th and the early 20th century, but more of that will help.
Yeah. I've always tried
math and science, it's languages as well.
I've always tried through my career to argue that higher education has a responsibility to help pre-K through 12. And I've crafted it in both Philadelphia and New York as a neighborhood issue, because in both places, my institution was located in a neighborhood that certainly could and welcomed the help of our faculty and our students in improving curriculum and professional development and working with students in tutoring situations. And those are things that if higher education institutions would, kind of put their money where their mouth is and invest more in their local communities, make a statement about support for local public education. So
there are also other institutions in the community. I grew up in Cleveland in a working class neighborhood. My love of music came because the Cleveland Orchestra, one of the great orchestras of the world, invited public school kids to come to 2 performances during the course of a year. And that's where we heard our first live music, and what an impact it had on generations of kids. And there were also things that I remember, the Cleveland newspapers offering free tickets to the Cleveland Indians if you got straight A's. So we also got a bunch of Indian fans as a result. But the large institutions in the community found ways to support the public schools, the art museums, the orchestra, and they were welcomed by the school system as a way of supplementing the educational experience, whether it was a zoo or the museums or the art. And those things, I think, are very important in communities.
No, I certainly agree, but you're raising the importance of music as an example. Brings in another thought, which is that we have really broadened what we expect from schools. I mean, we expect them to produce music lovers, but we also expect a lot of social and emotional support. We expect schools to be in close touch with parents, hopefully, to feed children. We give breakfast and lunch to children in communities where that's needed. And some have argued that we just keep loading more and more on the education system without necessarily giving them the additional resources or helping in their capacity to do this.
Well, I'm a big fan of that. The social determinants of health and education are these wraparound services.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that we could feed kids during COVID through the school system turned out to be extremely important. Another role for the schools. And while the problem is that we haven't added the staffing on, that what you're really saying is we've asked the educators to take on these responsibilities in the schools, as opposed to what we should do, and that is adding a stream of staffing to play these roles, as opposed to asking the teachers to do additional things. And you're right, that they weren't trained for, but they're not trained for mental health either.
Yeah.
I mean, they're not trained for a whole range of issues, but we have to be careful about rethinking and reconceptualizing who works in schools if we want to add these services, which are critical to children learning.
Yeah, I learned yesterday that some of the educators on the panel I participated in were thinking about using some of the new federal investment for social workers and more mental health support. Of course, it's a challenge because it's time-limited money and it can't be sustained over time, but they have to try to figure out how to do that.
Right. Susan, this goes back to the very beginning of our conversation, which is what is the expectation? What is public education, right? What do we think it's supposed to do? And I think that Donna correctly has identified that we've expanded dramatically now what we think it's supposed to do. If you ask people 50 years ago, they thought it was to educate our kids. And now it's, oh no, there's 12 other things. It's to feed our children and provide safety for them. And I think that the real question is not just, Donna pointed out, we're expecting the teacher somehow to do this magically, that it's really a resource question. Are we, if we're going to redefine the role of the public school to this larger societal role, are we willing to put the resource behind it, whatever that means? And right now we're trying to squeeze the same resource, but expand the mission. And that is something that we have to address as a society over time. And I think this is, again, Jeff made the really point, which is you never want to, it's very difficult to think of COVID as having a silver lining, but maybe one of the things that it does is cause the spotlight to come out on what we're really doing, and will cause the conversation to begin to say, wait a second, if that's really what we want, are we set up for that? What do we need to do to achieve that end?
Well, I think that's a really good note on which to bring this conversation to a close. So I would just ask each of you for a concluding thought about maintaining public education's central role in American society, and how we can best do that in the future. Donna?
Well, I obviously believe that we don't have a future as a nation without a strong public education system. And that means that every single one of us have to step forward and keep repeating over and over again that we have to support our public schools. And this trimming around the edges to take resources out of public schools is very dangerous. I gave an exam when I taught the politics of education a few years ago at the University of Miami. And I said, what one thing would you do to protect the public schools? The best answer I got was campaign finance reform.
Elaborate on that a little for an international audience.
What the kid was arguing was that money in politics shaped taking resources out of the public schools.
Right.
And the fact that anyone can make a contribution to a member of Congress or a local council person or a school board member, these elections, that was dangerous to the future of public schooling. And so all of us have to step up. I just think widespread support for public schools by leaders in the community, whether they're public or private leaders, is critical to the future of the country, of every country in the world.
Thank you. Jeff?
Well, I'd pick up on that in a couple of ways, which is, I think it's important to pursue this, but pursue this in the broader range of politics and issues, not just education. I mean, what we're seeing, some of the threats in education are threats to various kinds of gatekeeper institutions, traditional institutions that have been challenged across the country, the media, higher education, even the business world, and corporate world. The luster's gone off the rose in terms of how people sort of are willing to regard these big institutions. So the battle's a broader one than just public education. It's about public institutions and professionalism and the notion that collective institutions of various kinds can make the world better. It's not just what you fight for as an individual citizen. And I'd add that the arenas that matter, and this goes to the campaign finance rules, are not as they used to be in the US, and as they are in some countries still to some extent, kind of education-specific arenas where it's just a debate about what we do with the education money. These battles are being fought across a whole array of governance institutions. So it's a trickier battle, but there are allies who we can work with, whose main motivation might not be public education, but together we can craft an argument that is an effective one.
Stephen?
I guess I have the last voice. To me, there's not any question that the most important thing a society does to sustain itself is educate its young. That if you stop doing that as a society, the society will crater. And so to me, I'm with Donna, which is there's nothing more important than continuing to support the notion that young people have to be provided experiences and opportunities to develop and learn and thrive in our society. So how to do that? I regard a lot of the bipartisanship or the lack of bipartisanship now in this country and the factional that you have to do with, in some ways, about a failure of our system. And so I think that there has to be a commitment, and I think Donna's point and Jeff's about multiple institutions is critical. This is not just about the public school system. This is about how we as citizens in living with our governmental institutions, how do we create the kind of momentum necessary to sustain our society and continue to grow and continue to thrive and provide opportunity to everyone who lives in that society. So I'm with the program.
Thank you, everybody. I agree with everything that's been said. I just want to conclude with the hope that what we've learned over the past year, what parents have learned about the challenges of educating their children, will help overcome our dependence on media, particularly social media, for our information about education and about other institutions in society where we get what the algorithms send us instead of what maybe we should be learning. So hopefully this firsthand experience in the field of education that we've all had with virtual learning over the last year will teach us firsthand how important it is and what a challenge it is to educate our children. So thank you, panel. Thanks so much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I just want to jump in and thank you all also on behalf of FWE. This was really an amazing discussion, and I look forward to sharing this with everyone online. I also want to encourage everyone to explore previous installments of our webinar series on YouTube, but also to join our social media on Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn at FWE Forum, to visit our website at fweforum.org for more information about our work. All of you were really incredible and so genuine Your voices came across really well. And so thank you again for joining us today.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Yeah. Thank you. Bye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Susan, Donna, Stephen, and Jeff, for your comments. I really appreciate the rich discourse and just so many takeaways that I have. I think the first one that really resonates most with me that I absolutely love is this: we are citizens of a single nation. Yes, it's like one nation under God, not one race or wealthy or impoverished, but truly one nation under God. We end up demonstrating the strength of our nation by the educational opportunities that we provide for our children. And that's something that is really important for us to keep in mind. This discussion led me to just sort of wonder about the access piece, to kind of ask the question of, who has access to enriching educational programs and opportunities? And as I think about that, I've always been a proponent of public school education, even since I was a young child. My family were originally from Trinidad and Tobago, and they came to the United States in the late 1960s with the hopes of, entering the land of opportunity and making sure that those opportunities were provided for them and their family. What my parents learned very early on, my father of African descent and mother of Indian descent, was that yes, this is the land of opportunity. However, the opportunities really vary depending on what a person looks like or where a person lives. And for that reason, my parents decided to send my siblings and me to a private school where predominantly white, wealthy families sent their children to school. And so there was this true dissonance growing up, looking at who was in my schools, and then, of course, my neighborhood friends who looked very much like me. And as we would talk about our educational experiences, I realized that in many cases, they were about a year behind in terms of the content that was being provided. So the expectations were far greater at the school where I was. And so at a very young age, I committed myself to be a public school teacher in the town where I was born and raised, to make sure that every child received a high quality education, no matter what they looked like, no matter where they lived, to make sure that they felt respected and loved as well. And, that then led me on a path of, helping in that capacity in a school and serving as a high school soccer, basketball, and softball coach to help turn around school as a literacy coordinator. And then in 2005 to help turn around a school as a charter school principal. It was in 2009 that I was accepted to the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and I thought for sure my research would focus on effective school leadership, something along those lines. But I actually started asking the question, what does education look like for incarcerated youth? I think back to Stephen's comment when he shared that 50 years ago, he began researching alternative education. And I guess it's similar to that in that very little was out there in terms of juvenile justice education. And what are we doing for our most marginalized population? Again, disproportionately children of color, disproportionately children with special needs, children of poverty, mental health needs, and children who identify as LGBTQ or non-conforming. And I couldn't believe that in many places there was not even an educational program for that population. Many of the principals and teachers had not received any prior training, and yet, again, many of these children had not been in school for quite some time, had come through an alternative school pathway. And so, again, in looking at a nation, a local municipality, it's really important to see, for all the children, what educational programs are provided. we will get to see what lives we do value based on that type of education. I currently am on faculty at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, where I teach a course I designed titled Educating Incarcerated Youth, Practice, Research, Policy, and Advocacy. And I continue to support state leaders and local school organizations to make sure that everyone, to the extent possible, is equipped to ensure that the learners in their care are exposed to a high quality education program each day. And that goes for the young learners as well as the adult learners. On a personal level, in terms of education, we have two sons. Our younger son, we realized, needed a change within his educational space. We went full on public school education. He was in a dual language program from kindergarten through second grade. And so we felt like he was getting that academic challenge, but they made a change. And so for third grade, it was just sort of a basic, sort of regular third grade experience. And it definitely lacked the rigor and expectations that we hoped for and believed that he should be exposed to. And so we made a sacrifice after researching the top public school districts, top public elementary schools in the state of New Jersey, and came across a school and realized, all right, we have to make the sacrifice. And so we purchased a property. This is going back to 2019. And he was now able to attend this new school. And so we were so excited. He was excited. And yet, here's another realization. We do have a belief, again, based on our biases of who actually deserves a high quality education, who is ready for one, what the scholar looks like. And so I very early on had to have a conversation with them regarding the Pygmalion effect and really making sure that we have high expectations for all children, no matter what they look like. And even if they live in your town, guess what? They belong there. That was very interesting because that was the first year that he started, and it was also when COVID hit in 2020. What was really remarkable was to see the change that happened. So in his new school, there was plenty of space. When the new school year started in 2021, they started 90% of the students were in person. You had the option, but the majority of parents decided to send their children to school. The students were 6 feet apart. They had their masks. There was a lot of trust in the system. The school system that he had come from went months before they actually opened their doors. So again, you do see the disparities. We have to look and see where we are providing these rich experiences, just even in the physical layout of the building, of the play area, and make sure that we are addressing this equitable piece, and the equity piece is really, really important. Professionally, what this has taught, yes, COVID obviously has had an extremely negative impact throughout our world. On the positive side, though, we see platforms like this with Zoom and other web-based platforms of like, wow, in terms of professional development, we're not just limited to finding the most effective teacher. And sometimes we overwhelm that person with so many additional responsibilities, but we're so excited that they can serve as a mentor to their peers. Yes, mentoring can take place within the school building, but we realize with platforms like this, we can also provide mentoring and support from other high-performing, highly engaged educators in other states and even across the world. And so I think it is important that we don't miss out on those opportunities as well. Just a reminder to everyone that charter schools are public schools. I know that there still remains that debate. But it's really important that we do have, again, understanding why parents want a choice. It's the same choice that my parents felt strongly that they needed to make many years ago so that we would have a fighting chance. And my hope is through partnerships with the business communities, as was mentioned earlier, with higher education, community organizations, that we can work together, provide those wraparound services, and really demonstrate that we are all partners in this together. Again, thinking back to the African proverb, it takes a village to raise a child. It is time that we rise up as the needed village for all of our nation's children. How we view education and what we provide for our children, it really does determine if or how, to the extent we value each child's life. My hope is no matter what they look like, no matter where they live, that we ensure that every single child, every single day is exposed to a high quality education program. Thank you all so much. I look forward to more conversations regarding this very important topic of high quality public education for all our children.